Okay, I'm not going to shock you with saying it too loud. Hi. Welcome, everybody. And welcome to this evening's talk. I'm Lisa Simpson-Lutz. I'm the Executive Director of the Castine Historical Society. And this is our first hybrid lecture. That's, the new terminology we all now have after COVID. So we are actually live streaming this on our YouTube channel. So welcome to all of you out there in YouTube land. Thank you so much for watching. We appreciate it. And thank you so much to Zach, who is our tech expert up here, who is doing this for us. The event is also being recorded. So if you know people who couldn't attend, let them know that it will in about a week be uploaded onto our website and on our YouTube channel. All of the talks from this series are up, the ones that have already happened are up on our website, castinehistoricalsociety.org. So this is the fifth in a series of programs entitled Hidden Legacies, Uncovering Castine's African American History. The series is partially funded by a grant from the Maine Humanities Council, and it focuses on the untold stories of Maine and Castine's African Americans from the late 18th century up until the early 20th century. The series is a result of several years of ongoing research by the Historical Society staff and a commitment by the organization to uncover, tell, and preserve the unknown, forgotten, and even hidden stories of Black individuals and families who lived and worked here in Castine. To learn more about the programs, which will be held through October, please visit our website, castinehistoricalsociety.org, or you can pick up our brochure, which is over there on the table in the entrance there. And all of our programs for the season are here in the brochure. We also have past newsletters, including newsletters that have articles that we have written since 2000 about various aspects of Castine's African American history. So if you want to pick those up, if you haven't seen them, please pick them up and take them home and read about some of the research we've uncovered. Also, we hope that if you are not yet a member of the Historical Society, you would consider joining. Of course, we brought membership brochures or membership envelopes. We'd love to have you join. And it's really through membership dollars that we are able to also put on programs like this. So we would appreciate your support. Members also get discounts on special events, and they also get 10% in our gift shop. So looking ahead, our next program in the series is on August 10th, which is a Thursday at 7 o'clock. That's the Deborah Pulliam Memorial Lecture. That's our biggest lecture that we have every year in honor of one of our largest donors, Deborah Pulliam. And that is going to be at Maine Maritime Academy's Delano Auditorium. We are bringing Dr. Kate McMahon from the Smithsonian Institution to speak on her special topic that she has researched, which is about slavery in Maine. So I encourage you to come to that talk as well. One other program that is sort of related, but not really, that we have coming up, that is also on the desk in the front. We are holding stakeholder meetings this summer, and our next one is Tuesday, what's the date? July 18th. Tuesday, July 18th at 4 o'clock. It's going to be at the Abbott School, which is our exhibit building, in the Mitchell Room, which is in the basement. What we are doing, we're in a long-range plan to renovate the second floor of the Abbott School and install a permanent exhibit on the history of Castine. Those of you who come visit often, you know that our exhibits are temporary in nature. They focus on various aspects of Castine history, but don't tell the whole history. So we'd like to hear from you as community members. What are your ideas about what stories are we not telling right now in Castine? What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? We want to hear from you so that we can make a better exhibit that really reflects the whole history of Castine. So we hope that you can attend. These are all, we have then 2 more in August. It's all the same meeting. You don't have to come to all of them, but we really do want to hear from you. So I hope you can attend that. Plus, we're going to be serving some wine. So we realized after the first one, sorry for those of you that attended Zoom, like you, Jerry, but if you want to come again, you might get a glass of wine. All right, so tonight I am thrilled to introduce our speaker, Pam Cummings. And while searching for speakers for this Hidden Legacy series, we reached out to Pam, who is the president and co-director of educational programs at the Abyssinian Meeting House in Portland. And in addition to her work at the Meeting House, Pam has also for over 20 years she has experience in identifying and cultivating partnerships with local business leaders, fundraising, and event planning. So we're really excited to hear from Pam tonight about this African American Meeting House in Portland because it has unique ties to Castine. For those of you that heard my talk in May, which seems like 100 years ago, and also the article I wrote about the Niles family of Castine, you will know that the Niles family lived here in the 1820s, well, actually from 1806 on, and one of their sons, Abraham Niles, who grew up here, he went to school here. As a young man, he and his brother moved to Portland to continue their career as sailors. When Abraham was there, he was one of the men who helped found the Abyssinian Meeting House, and he was also a deacon. And the other thing that he did was he was a political fixer, like a political influencer among the African American community in Portland. So, we were just talking about this really amazing coincidence. I got to know the woman who lives in Abraham Niles' house, which is right next to the Abyssinian Meeting House, through Ancestry.com. And together, she had all the research on the family in Portland. I had all the research on the family in Castine. Together, we put it together and created this amazing story about this free family who were basically, from what we can tell, the first free African-American family to live in Castine. And so we're thrilled to hear about Portland's Abyssinian Meeting House. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Pam Cummings. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you for having me this evening. What a beautiful location. I'm a little bit upset that I didn't get here a little earlier so that I could have enjoyed the scenery. I haven't been to Castine since, well, I won't do that, but I haven't been here for a while. When I was in college, a friend of mine went to school here, and I came to visit here when he was here, and that was a little while ago. But still just as beautiful as it was then. So thank you so much for having me. I kind of like to always start out with something just a little bit light because we all kind of, or I'm frazzled. I got here and hurried and try to give you the best that I can give you on the information that I have. And so I'll open up with just something light. There was a gentleman and he owned a large piece of property in Louisiana. And he would often have a lot of family and events. And every time that he had one of these events, he would bring his family down to the body of water that he had. And in there were lots of alligators. And he would just show them. And one day there was a gentleman that he kind of pulled apart from the crowd. And he said, I tell you, I'll give you $1 million if you jump from this side, swim over to the other side without stopping, and when you get on the other side, I will greet you with a check for $1 million. And the guy said, you must think I'm crazy. No, because he could see, everybody was jumping up, the alligators and everything. And so they started to walk away, and he heard this, psh, a splash. And he looked over his shoulder, and he saw a gentleman in the water frantically swimming across to get to the other side. He wasn't looking back, wasn't doing anything, just trying to get across. And the guy said, oh, God, I got to get my checkbook. I got to get over there. I got to meet him because he's the only person who's ever taken me up on this. I got to give him $1 million. He hurried, he got over there, he met the guy, he made it to the other side. And he said to the other man, "Oh my gosh, is there anything you want to say? Because I got to give you this check. I told you I was going to give you the check for $1 million. You're $1 million richer." The guy said, "Yeah, I just have one question." And he said, "What would that be?" And he said, "Who pushed me?" So, truth of the matter is, most of the things that are done, somebody's pushing us, right? A lot of people, you need to be pushed. In his case, he was pushed to get that $1 million. In the case of the Abyssinian Meeting House, they were pushed, the members of the Abyssinian Meeting House were pushed to want and have change. They were all members at the time at the First Parish Church, which is on Congress Street, located in Portland. And when they were members there, they weren't allowed to worship openly amongst the rest of the congregation. They were relegated to the balcony, much like the balcony here, or they had to stay in the back of the church, in the corners of the church. And there were 6 black men, free black men, who then said, "We will no longer tolerate this behavior," right? They were pushed to the point of, this is no longer acceptable for us. And at the same time, churches in Philadelphia, black churches in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., Philadelphia and New York were being established. And so they also helped those gentlemen know what the plans were like to build their own church. So these 6 men decided that they wanted to establish their own church. So they petitioned the First Parish Church in Portland and said to them, "We oftentimes don't feel welcomed here. People come here from other places. They're not welcomed. They're not able to buy pews, and I don't know if you know this or not, but when you're able to buy pews, that meant you were a tax-paying citizen, which as a taxpayer you have more rights, more voice, more power than you did if you didn't. So they felt that they didn't have much power or rights because they couldn't even buy a pew. Anyway, they petitioned and they were able to separate, and they began their own church. And it was then, at that time, it was called the Fourth Congregationalist Church. And they established it, and they then began to have their own services in what is today called the Abyssinian Meeting House. The church had changed names several times in between when they got it and when it ended. Reuben Ruby helped them by financing the Abyssinian Church, which in 1832, they changed names from the Congregationalist Church to the Abyssinian Church. But during that time, they were having hard times. They weren't able to pay their bills on time, and bill collectors were coming to Reuben Ruby and saying, "Where's our money, and we need to be paid." And he went to those members that he helped to establish this church and said, "I no longer wish to be a part of this. I would like to get my money back." And so they had to find a way and establish themselves, and they then became the Abyssinian Religious Society because he was adamant. He wanted his money. It created quite a bit of stress. And Reuben Ruby, I don't know if you know much about him, if you've talked about him at all, but Reuben Ruby was an astute businessman. And when he sold them that property, he had sold it he bought the whole street for $250, and then he sold each piece of land for $250. So if you go on that street, there are quite a few homes, and you would see that he was just a very astute businessman. But the members at the Abyssinian Meeting House were they were globally minded people. They were educated people. They had a system in which they had ministers that would come into. There were about 5 of them. They had a circuit. They were college educated, all of them educated in New York, at a college in New York. And then they would circle between Massachusetts, Connecticut, Philadelphia, and New York. They were here in Maine. And they would all spend time here in the state of Maine and then move on to the next, and that person would then come back around, and that's what they did. And it was there that Reuben Ruby, who I was telling you about, he's a hack driver. And for those of you who don't know, hack driver essentially is just a modern day Uber, right? You just called and you said, we need you to be at the docks at this time, or we need you to be here at this time. And one of his jobs that he happened to pick up William Lloyd Garrison. And that was a big deal, because William Lloyd Garrison was coming this night to speak to the Quakers in Portland about the evils of slavery and how to undo all of the evils of it, and he wanted to talk to them about it. And one of the gentlemen there, Fessenden, he came, and that night, his mind was changed, and he joined forces with Garrison, and then began to spread the message of the anti-slavery movement. William Lloyd Garrison, when he spoke that night at the Quakers' house, the women had to usher him out, and usher in a nice way, I guess, not really. But he was ushered out because of the message that he had, and people were not happy with him. And William Lloyd Garrison, the thing about him is that he believed in women, in their voices, so much to the point that they started calling them the Garrisonians, named after him, the women, because they were the same causes that he had. They were all aligned with one another. And so he delivered that speech that night. They all joined forces. And now the Abyssinian Religious Society has now been changed to the Abyssinian Church. And the Abyssinian Church is very, very, very important to the history of Maine, so much to the point that everybody now understands the value, that why they're busy trying to restore the building, why there's so much hidden history. I work with a lot of school-age children that come into the building. We do speaking engagements like this where we can talk, and not everybody has known about African-American history in Maine, right? For a long time, it didn't exist. I grew up in Portland and did not even know the Abyssinian Meeting House existed. My sister, Deborah Cummings Kadrawi, founded the committee that restores the Abyssinian Meeting House. She didn't know it existed either until she read an article in the newspaper that said this building must be saved. And she began to save the stories and the building. But the reason that it's so important to Maine's history is that people don't really understand its ties to the Underground Railroad, or in fact, that people in Maine had anything to do with the Underground Railroad, when in fact, those members of that church were quite extensively involved with the Underground Railroad. Because of the Abyssinians' proximity to the water, it was one of the most northernmost points that these slaves had to get to. And if you got there, you were pretty well on your way to freedom. And so I don't know if you know it or not, but they had the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that you slaves in Maine, you could walk around freely. But if you were a runaway slave and your slave owner put your name with a bounty hunter, which meant somebody that could pay to have you killed if they find you, because you made it this far, but you can't be free. The law states that we can come and we can get you and bring you back to the South where you are from. Because the slave owners, all of their money is tied up. It would almost be like a major investment that you make. We all like to invest in homes, right? We buy our homes that we live in, and all their money was tied to these slaves. And so it was really important that they held on to their slaves, that they didn't run away, and they fought tirelessly to catch any runaway slaves that they could. Um, the path that most of them took to the state of Maine was they started out, most of them in the South Carolinas, North Carolina, South Carolina, down at the Atlanta or the Georgia area, and they kind of hugged the coast. And the reason that they hugged the coast is because most of them came by way of boat. And the way that the Abyssinian Meeting House, or most people, were able to pull this off was that they were on, but at that time, black men were able to have jobs on the boats and on the ships. And so they had schedules of the comings and the goings of the slaves that were stowed away on these boats. And they would give information like that to Reuben Ruby, who I just told you about. And Reuben would meet them at the docks, which the Abyssinian is really 3 blocks from that water. And Reuben Ruby would pick them up at the docks, and I don't mean pick them up. What we tend to do is we tend to glamorize this whole story about the Underground Railroad. There was nothing beautiful about it. In hindsight, in retrospect, the only thing beautiful is that it was a time that black and white people worked together very wonderfully for a very good cause of freeing slaves and ending slavery. Other than that, there was nothing beautiful about it. You often hear that, or black people, the slaves or the stakeholders in slavery don't get enough credit, because a lot of people assume that it was the white people that were leading them to their freedom, when in fact it was mostly them. By the time they got to the people helping them, all the hard work had really been done. Them leaving the farm, them having the courage to leave where they were, because they could have been killed. Most of them, beaten. They looked hard to find you when you did escape. But anyway, back to the Abyssinian Meeting House. Reuben Ruby would meet them, the hack driver, pick them up, and people often ask little kids when they come into the building, they say, well, show us, first, where did the train come? Where did the train come? And I usually like to start out, and I'm sorry I didn't, my lectures by letting everybody know that the Underground Railroad is not a train. And I don't say that to shame anybody. I don't need to see any faces. I say it because good story. I was with a gentleman preparing to do a talk like this with a group of people. And I spent about an hour and a half with him, making sure my computer was on and mic check and everything we had to do. And getting ready to leave. And he said, hey, do you want me to put a picture of the train up there for you? Oh, my heart sunk, right? But my heart sunk. But as you said, I do education for the Abyssinian Meeting House. So what that just told me is that my job wasn't finished. I still had a lot of work to do. And so I always like to start out also by letting everybody know that the Underground Railroad is not about a train. Okay. Okay. Can you still hear me? I kind of speak loud anyway, right? So it's not. How's that? How's this? I don't really need that. Okay. My children tell me I don't need a mic, right? basically the Underground Railroad gets its name from, during that time, the United States of America was beginning their railroad system. So they used a lot of the same terminology, and it was nothing more than the Underground Railroad is nothing but codes, secret codes, and methods used of transporting the slaves from the South to the North and being able to speak openly about it. Because it was during that time that black people were thought of as being dumb and stupid and lazy and unable to learn anything. And for the first time with this Underground Railroad, they showed just how stupid they were. They were able to outsmart so many people because they were now able to have these slaves escape freely. Some of the codes they used were songs. The terminologies that they used were the train, which they could use, which was the method that the people were going to be brought from the north, from the south to the north with. They used cargo as a term, which the cargo were the people. The homes, the safe homes where they were going, were also referred to. So they had a lot of terminologies. They had all of the same terminology used in the railroad system, so nobody really ever figured out exactly what it was that they were doing. And they were able to get away with a lot. And so, as I was telling you before, Reuben Ruby would meet in Portland with its ties, the ties that Portland, Maine has, the Abyssinian Meeting House has to the Underground Railroad, was because it was so accessible to water, and because so many of the members or the men there worked on the boats that were at the water, they had access to the schedules of the people that were being stowed away, if you will. They didn't buy a ticket to get on that boat and come from the south to the north. They were stowaways, right? And the people would put them in their boats, and they would go from port to port. And when they got to Portland, Reuben Ruby would meet them there. And so oftentimes when I have children in the building, they want to know, where did you keep the slaves here? They weren't there in the Abyssinian Meeting House because, as I told you, with that Fugitive Slave Act, you couldn't, if they were caught, and believe me, that would have been one of the first places that they would have gone to find the slaves. But the members of the Abyssinian Meeting House worked with other members of the Quaker community in Portland, and it was there that the Quakers provided housing. So Reuben Ruby, as I told you, the hack driver, would meet this is just one instance where he would meet a slave at the docks, and he would whisk them away. Oftentimes they traveled under the guise of evening and in the winter because the nights were longer and they could do more. But he would meet them, and they would operate they would take him to the barber shop. And the reason that you bring somebody to the barber shop is because sometimes you'd have to change appearances because you forget these bounty hunters. They knew exactly what you had on, exactly what you were wearing, exactly what you looked like. And number one, because you're slave owner, you only had so many outfits, right? So they knew exactly what it was that you had on when you left, and so they would change their appearance so that they could then move on. And then you would go from there to a secondhand clothing store. And these places were all members of the Abyssinian Meeting House working. That was their answer to the Fugitive Slave Act, right? They had to get involved somehow, some way, and that was their answer, right? They wanted to get involved. They became stakeholders, which meant that they supported it financially. Some of the women in the Abyssinian Meeting House would make and sell things, and a lot of women did around the country to fund that Underground Railroad. And so they would change them, and then they would bring them to somebody's house that was there. There was a Mrs. Dennett. The Dennetts that lived up off of Spring Street in Portland. You know, members around it. But they would go into their homes, and that's where they would keep them. And they would keep them there until it was time to move on to someplace else. And also part of that Underground Railroad, the codes and the systems that they used were, if a candle was in your window, you knew if the candle was on or lit or not lit, whether it was safe to come and pick up this person. If the light was on, that meant, you know, come in. If it's off, you can't come in. Or so you just keep moving. You don't come in, you don't pick up that person. They had secret codes, the door knocks that they were able to use. So answer your door or don't answer your door. Because the people that were giving of their homes, they really were putting the lives of themselves and their families in danger. Had they been caught, you could go to jail. You could be killed. And so hence that was the reason that they had these secret codes. But they would bring them in there and they would feed them, the members of the Portland community, the Quakers, most of them, because they were dead set against slavery. But they would bring them into their homes. And they would wait until it was time to go. So there are a couple of different routes that they took out of Portland. One would be where they hugged the coast, hence, you know, Bath. And there are so many people that say, oh, my house was an Underground Railroad site. And in Portland, I will tell you, the Abyssinian Meeting House is only one of two official Underground Railroad sites recognized by National Park Service. We wear that badge very, very proudly because there was a lot of work that had to go into proving, because so many people do come and do say, you know, well, we had people here. I had somebody in, I don't know, somebody in Gray, Maine, and they did go by way of Wyndham as well. So when you do hear of these sightings in the Wyndham area, that's not unusual, it's not uncommon, because they did go that way as well, up in Canada that way. And again, that was the goal, right? The goal is to get you to Canada, because when you get to Canada, you are free and free indeed. As long as you're in Maine, you can be, can be revoked. If they find you, you're going back. And so the Abyssinian worked tirelessly to help those runaway slaves to freedom. They also got involved in the Anti-Slavery Society. That became big. People don't quite understand. Frederick Douglass had come to the Abyssinian Meeting House to speak. In our restoration effort, the Abyssinian Meeting House, we have these floors, and we had great debate over, you know, how these floors should look, right? Because we're restoring this building, and we're going to make sure it's beautiful, museum quality. And one of our architects went to the Meeting House in Boston, because there are two other in Boston and Nantucket. They're bigger and older, and then the Abyssinian Meeting House. But she went and she came back and she said, "Oh, we can't do these floors." And we were like, "Oh, really?" And she said, "No, you really can't." And she told us all about it, and we just agreed, right? That's where the history is. When you come into that building, the history's on those floors. That's where the conversations were held, the people pacing those floors, the blood, the sweat, the tears dripping on those floors, right? We got to keep those floors, because that's where the Anti-Slavery Society, well, the Anti-Slavery Society was founded in the basement of the Abyssinian Meeting House. The women at the Abyssinian Meeting House did a lot of work, a benevolent society in the community with the black people. They helped them. So there's so much history in all of the work. And what's so funny is that, and it's not really funny, I use these phrases, but I don't mean them as I say them, but this history nobody knows about. And there are so many people that come to the Abyssinian doing research and looking for more information, because there's not a lot of information, right? There's some, I mean, we have church notes. We have people that are part of the family. Bob Green, who's a great historian in Portland, his family was a big part of it. We have the McKenzies, June McKenzie and Marita McKenzie, who sit on our board. Their grandfather was also involved. But people don't have that much knowledge and not that much information. People don't know that also in that building we had a schoolhouse that was funded by taxpayers in the city of Portland, which at that time we were only one of 5 in the entire country that was educating black students, and they gave them musical lessons, and they were able to teach them almost like the Statue of Liberty, right? They had said they didn't want these students, and the minister there, you know, give me these tired, the poor, the children who can't learn, the undisciplined, the unruly, and I will take it on. I will take this challenge on myself. And so he educated them there until people in Portland said, absolutely no more. We don't want to pay for schools. Everybody needs to go to school together. Portland being progressive Portland as it is, right? They didn't put them out because they were black. They wanted to stop paying because they didn't want it. Their color was green, not black, right? So they wanted them to all integrate. And Portland did such a great job doing that they became a model of integration around the country. And so others came to ask, how did you do that? We didn't think, right? You just did it, and they did it quite well. I'm sorry? With the, so I think the school, I think it was from 18, my dad usually comes with me. He's 87 years old, and he's my guy. I don't dare to say dates anymore because I'm on live, and somebody will jump all over me, guaranteed, if I don't get the right date. But he used to sit here, and I'd say 1848 very confidently, and he would nod, and I knew I was right, or he would say, 47, and I'd say, oh, 47. But I don't have them anymore, so I don't dare to get real specific with you, but I believe it was in around the 1840s that happened, 1846, I want to say. And anybody else, any questions that you have? I'm here to talk, but it goes both ways, so feel free to ask any other questions. Go ahead. Everybody asks that every time I come. Black. Yeah, they use it in Africa, they use it a lot. Black. But anyway, let's get back to the Underground Railroad and the Abyssinian members. So they have all of this rich history about the work that they did to end slavery, to end evils of slavery, but also, again, the members of the Abyssinian, and I'd like to really make sure that I make this well known, were globally minded men. That's why they were involved with this anti-slavery society. They would send delegates all over the world, not just the country. So when I say globally, I do mean they were globally minded individuals. Fighting the fight to end freedom. Women then had voices, other voices for their freedom, right? And oftentimes people like to think that the civil rights movement in the 1960s was really the beginning of civil rights. I like to differ and say that the Abyssinian Meeting House was really one of the first things in Maine, one of the first civil rights movements in Maine, because they were fighting for their right to worship openly in that church. So they were really then saying, you're not going to treat us this way. We demand to be respected and treated. And that's how they started becoming involved with these other activities in the Abyssinian Meeting House. And I'm sorry I called the Abyssinian Meeting House because that's what it's named today. It did go to the Abyssinian Church. It is no longer a church. The SS Portland, the sinking of the SS Portland happened, and when that happened, 19 of the Abyssinian Meeting House members went down in that. Most of those men, as I told you, they worked on the boats, and they were mariners, if you will, and they, when the boat went down in Massachusetts, off of the coast of Massachusetts, I don't know if anybody knows of that story, but it's deemed sometimes the Titanic of the Northeast. And when that boat went down, it took down 19 of its members, and most of those members were men. And they had provided, because they had the steady jobs in their households, and they had provided the money for the Abyssinian Meeting House to do all that it did. And those salaries went when they went down. So the Abyssinian Meeting House, shortly after that, was forced to close. Also, at the Abyssinian Meeting House, so I have to stop and catch my breath here, and I'll tell you why. Because I do this talk on the Underground Railroad, and the Abyssinian, with its ties to the Abyssinian, and really I should have the Abyssinian Meeting House with its ties to the Underground Railroad, because it's very hard for me to talk more about the Underground Railroad than it is the Abyssinian Meeting House, because it's the Abyssinian Meeting House that came to represent freedom, that came to represent how collective voices together working can end these evil practices or slavery, right? So it's really hard for me to talk about one more than the other. So if you find me going more towards the Abyssinian, please just pull me back and ask me a question about the Underground Railroad. But it becomes very difficult for me to talk more about the Underground Railroad, because that was a period of time during the Abyssinian Meeting House, and a lot of people want me to come and give you all of this glorious stories about how people were rescued and how people were perceived and how people did the things that they did, when in fact we don't have a lot of history on that. What we do have a lot of history on is the Abyssinian Meeting House and what they did and how the changes that they made impact even today, right? And so when I first started doing this, and I would bring people in, and everybody sort of like you or me, we would sit and we would listen. And now we have groups of children in the state of Maine, in Portland, who are from all over the world, who have experienced a lot of what I'm talking about. And so they're able to find kind of their story and our story, right? They left their country. We didn't leave freely in Africa. I'll be clear about that. But a lot of these children come from war-torn countries, and they come to the United States, or they come here to Portland more specifically, to find, out about the Abyssinian Meeting House, and they're able to connect with the stories that they have. That hasn't always been that way, and that's a direct result and a product of the Abyssinian Meeting House, right? Because before Deborah, my sister, founded the Committee to Restore the Abyssinian Meeting House, there wasn't a lot talked about as far as Black history went. Now, there were people that fought the fight, and I certainly will not take that away from my uncle is Gerald Talbot, who resides in Portland, my father Leonard Cummings, Tim Wilson, Anita Talbot, June McKenzie. There were a bunch of them fighting that fight for a long time, and sometimes it's upsetting because people forget you didn't always have the rights that you have today without people like members of the Abyssinian Meeting House having to fight the fight that they fought. And so, yes, I like to talk about the Underground Railroad, but it really becomes really hard to do without really talking about the Abyssinian. Are there any specific questions about the Underground Railroad? And I will just continue to move forth in my normal manner. But if you have any other questions that you would like to ask, please feel free as I go along. Go ahead.
The first question here is, has the Neil Dow House in Portland ever been established as an Underground Railroad site?
No, not that I know of. What I know is what I know, and that is the Abyssinian Meeting House in Portland is one of only 2 sites in the state of Maine that has been recognized by National Park Service as an official Underground Railroad site. And the second would be the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, the room in which she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin.
We have another one. Do we
Okay, so that goes back to my point. That's why it's really important to educate people. Yeah, she needs you to.
Oh, sorry. Do we know what the coastal route and the stations of the railroad down the coast from Portland to towards Canada?
I don't think she means railroad, maybe just the stops on
Yeah, that's what I know what he meant. I just want to make sure that you heard. Okay. So basically, do we know what the stops were on the Underground Railroad along that coastal route? And again, that goes back to what I tell you, absolutely not. Why you wouldn't be able to document anything at all, because if you did, they would have gone and met you there and taken those slaves back. And you think about how far it is from North Carolina, South Carolina to get to Maine, all that they've gone through, all that they've been through, the toils, the tears, everything. They're finally here in Maine. Almost, you can almost see Canada. They're not going to mess it up here. And absolutely, no, you don't have, there are a lot of people that make claims to the Underground Railroad sites, and there really aren't many that.
Do we know how many slaves that,
How,
you know, how many slaves?
you couldn't, right? Who's keeping track? You can't really keep track. Again, because you're here with that freedom, with the Fugitive Slave Act, you can't. You can't keep, you really and truly, you're putting your life, your family, everything at stake, because these people made a lot of money. These bounty hunters made a lot of money searching and seeking runaway slaves, right? And so there is no real history. You have some people like Bob Green, who's the historian that I told you about, whose family was a part of it. And he does have actual things from his family, if you will, that kept track of what went on in Portland. Unfortunately, those are Bob's and not the Abyssinian Meeting House. But he shares them. The story about Reuben Ruby and the parcel. I happened to be in the building one day when he was doing a tour, and I heard him say that. I had never known that about him buying the block and then selling each plot separately. And I said, "Are you kidding me? Is that true?" And he said, "Oh yeah." And I said, "Wow, you need to keep that someplace and write a book." And he said, "Oh, it's someplace." So, and you hear him; he speaks around a lot.
He was our first speaker.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, Bob is related to me. I think everybody in Maine, right? Not everybody, but that's the way it used to be anyway. But go ahead.
If you don't know how many slaves came through, did the newspapers report how many slaves were apprehended by bounty hunters?
No. Who cared back then? I don't mean to be so cold and calculus. I was on the radio one day with another young woman who, she had a good job, and she had, a person had called in and asked that question, and she said, "Oh, no, they just forgot." And I said, "Oh God, I got to stop you. They didn't forget, they didn't care. They didn't care who came, who went, black people, they didn't care, it didn't matter. So they didn't keep history. I mean, even some of the people that I know that are historians here in the state of Maine, and one woman in particular that I told you about, she did Freedmen's Bureau. And so it's even hard for her to track who came here because, Negro boy, Negro girl, mulatto, mulatto girl, mulatto boy, they didn't matter.
You would think because money was involved that there might have been more interest. Maybe up here there wasn't.
Exactly.
Maybe down.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, because money was everything, right? Money was everything, and it was a lot of money that they were getting paid, and a lot of money that people would have to pay if they got caught with these slaves in their home, these runaway slaves. If they found abating anything to do with the slaves, they could get into, your family killed, you killed.
This is making me wonder when the United States started doing the census.
1790. Census goes back to 1790.
Okay, so
But they were,
They're runaways. They're runaways. They're not here. I think so I think the best place to probably go would be Canada, right? To find out what their census is. I think that they would have a more accurate, because these people are now citizens there. They are allowed to walk around freely. Slavery didn't exist there for them. In the state of Maine? No.
That is an interesting point, though, that Canada would probably have some.
Yeah, yeah. You
They were actually acknowledged.
They still have a very large population of black people there because that's where they went, and that's where they ended up settling.
That was my question. Is there a particular area in Canada where they gravitated to, or just get across the border?
So Nova Scotia has a large black population. And my grandmother was from Canada, Fredericton, New Brunswick. So no, I'm not sure, but I do know that there, if you go online, I tend to Google a lot. And that's kind of how I even really got involved with the Abyssinian, was during Black History Month and trying to trace back, you know, the people and where they came from and how they got there. And they just have a lot of organizations for runaway slaves. There's a lot of information in Canada. And we're doing very well in Maine to have the information that we had, because if you think about, and as I told you, this was highly secretive, right? They had codes, and these are people that had to follow, you know, the North Star. They didn't have GPS systems, and you think about that, I mean, my God, I'm in a car with a GPS system and get lost coming up here, right? And this happens an awful lot. You know, I get lost, and it happened one other time, and I'm like, oh my goodness, how do they do it, right? They didn't even have a GPS, recalculating, nothing. You know, they just looked up at the North Star, they looked at the trees to find out where the moss was, and they knew if there was moss on that tree, they were heading in the right direction, right? Jumping in the water. You know, the song, Wade in the Water, they had to wait in the water. God was going to trouble the water, right? So you had to throw off the scent, the dogs, they had to wait. And then when it was safe to go, they'd throw rocks in or make owl noises or make bird noises for the people to know you can now get out and keep it moving. So they just went through a lot, and highly secretive. That's all I can tell you. The whole organization was highly secretive. Mm-hmm.
Sorry for you all to interrupt your program, but I'm wondering, you know, the slaves that settled above the Mason-Dixon line, the slaves that were freed, if after the Emancipation Proclamation there was an exodus back south to other family members, like where, you know, they had maybe had more roots or were going to try their to live independently in the South.
Well, so by definition, when you go down south, even now, they have a much larger black population, which would let you know that absolutely they did go back there and they did settle with their families, while others of them, you know, the fear of the Fugitive Slave Act popping up again, or, you know, having to be kept there, they chose Canada or other parts of the country, and yes, some of them did go back to the South because that's where their families were, or what they knew, or where they wanted to be, right? It's very different. A lot of us, we choose Florida over Maine in the winter, right? we choose the Carolinas over Maine in the winter. They were no different.
You mentioned the Quakers.
Yeah.
Were instrumental in helping with the Abyssinian Church.
Yes, they were.
Could you describe in a little more detail what they did, and also were there other groups in Portland that also supported the foundation of the church and their activities in and around Iowa?
So, in answer to other groups that may have helped the Abyssinian Church, not that I'm aware of, because that became the social hub. The Abyssinian Meeting House today, Abyssinian Church, Fourth Congregationalist Church, Abyssinian Religious Society, it's all the same. But they did not have many people helping. That's why the Freedom Trail, if you ever get a chance at the Freedom Trail in Maine, in Portland, it really shows you who the people were that were helping, not just black people. There are a few white people. Their homes are in there as well. The Quaker Church, or the Quaker Meeting House, which is where William Lloyd Garrison went for the first time, and he was able to tell Reuben Ruby about this, what was going on in the rest of the country, and then Reuben was able to give it to the members of the Abyssinian Meeting House. Hence, that's how they began the Abyssinian, or the religious, the anti-slavery society in the basement of the Abyssinian Meeting House. But, so it just, they did so many great things, and you'll hear me say this over and over again. The women did, the Benevolent Society, and the helping they worked collectively. And I think what's really so disappointing is that we look today at the world the way that it is, and it's amazing because the population of black people back then was very, very small compared to today. You know, as I said, I grew up here, and we used to be able to drive down Congress Street. My mother would say, "Oh, who's that?" And I'd be able to tell her. My mother grew up in Portland, my mother and father. And so when we're at a stoplight now, and my mother, we could be sitting, you know, five-way, and 5 of the people in those cars are black. It wasn't like that when I was growing up. And so my mother still says, "Oh, who's that?" And I think, are you kidding me? How do I know, right? We have so many brown-skinned people now in Portland, or in the state of Maine even, right? Places that we never thought would ever be. And a lot of what they do today is really what the members of the Abyssinian Meeting House started, right? We had the secondhand clothing store, we had the bookstore, we had the barber shop. In the bookstore, they were able, or the secondhand clothing store too, they were able to, in Massachusetts, stick messages about what was going on in the world of slavery and things that they could do inside, in the coats, right? In the lining of the coat. And again, it was secret. How many lives could we know were touched? We don't, because it was all done in secret. And when they found out, they shut that down real quick. So, and I don't mean in a pretty way, because as I said, what I don't like to do is glamorize the Underground Railroad, because there's nothing glamorous about it. I have a PowerPoint that goes into so much more detail about when the Underground Railroad was taking place, how many people were actually affected by slavery. I mean, we were living in a world that was pretty much free, yet and still we had a population that was living in slavery, those horrid, wretched conditions of slavery, and they existed, and that was the job of the Abyssinian Meeting House members, the bookstore, the clothing store, the hair store, the Quaker Church, all of these different people. That was their job, to get the word out, to spread the word, to work to end it, and they did. I mean, slavery did end, and there's still, you know, still a lot of fights to fight regarding that, but they did a great job when they had it.
I hate to interrupt, but
I don't want you to.
more about, you know, anything you know about the women in the Abyssinian church and what they did, because I've spent a little time reading about it, and that's the question I have.
So again, do you find that you don't find very much information about what the women at the Abyssinian church were doing?
I have read some of the minutes, of the
Yeah.
digitized minutes, and I noticed there's a lot of presence of women, and I've had a hard time figuring out just from reading it, were these minutes of a ladies, like women's auxiliary, were they...
Exactly right.
Or they, you know, general meetings, you know, because the men were at sea a lot,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So the women must have been...
So it was more in the form of an auxiliary for these women, and you'll notice that in the notes. I will tell you, speaking of that, and you know, we have some pretty heated board meetings at the Abyssinian Meeting House today. Did I forget to tell you 6 of the members of the board are my family? But anyway, we have some pretty heated meetings about what we want and what we don't want. And so we had our anthropologist, Martha Pinello, out of New Hampshire. She came in and Black History Month, and she was reading us the minutes, or she was telling us about all these meetings. And she was telling us how great these people were and all the different things that they did. And then she said, and a lot of their meetings, they were heated, explosive, and they were highly, people were fighting back then. And we all looked and we thought, okay, we're okay. Because, I mean, it's a very passionate cause. You can only imagine. My sister, who's the founder, has her opinions. I'm the president of the board who have my opinions. And then you have my father who consider himself to be the founder, and we know there's only one founder, right? Because that's when a person finds it, the person founds it. And I have another vocal sister and another mother, and so we all sit on the same board, and we do whatever we can to make it through. But so I know that to be true. There was those minutes that were kept from a lot of the meetings that took place. And yes, that's the women, the benevolence that they extended into the community, into that Black community, would have been that. People that could be here legally, people that weren't from the South, that could stay here, they would help them. They would provide, the food, the clothing. And still today, as in many different groups of people and communities, when somebody new comes in from someplace else, you all kind of get around, surround the purpose, or the person, or the group, or the place that they came from to help them. And that's what the women did. They provided warmer clothes for them, and a lot of the work that they did was also with the Anti-Slavery Society. And do I have any questions that I didn't answer, or thoughts that you might have? I know the question that I always get is, about the sites, the Underground Railroad sites. And so I can't tell you enough. I know and I convey to you the history of the Underground Railroad in Portland, which were the slaves coming from the south to the north. The Abyssinian was one of the last stops because of its proximity to the water and the members there who got together to help these people. And there was just so much good work done by them. And so, so much that this isn't just a state treasure. The U.S. Government just gave us $1.7 million to complete the restoration of the entire building. Yeah, it's a real good thing. My sister Debbie, who I keep telling you about, she did the grant, or not the grant. It's an earmark, so we don't, it's money that is given to us by the government because they understand how important this building, the history that go into the building. I dare say I can never tell you the person's name, but I was so ashamed of him, and he had said to me, well, who cares about the building? Anybody really cares about are the people and their stories. Shame on him, because that building, when you drive by, and if you ever get a chance to go into Portland, represents way more than just four walls, right? It represents anybody who ever had to fight for anything, right? To be seen, to be heard. I can bring school-age children in there who can identify because they've been bullied. We had a group of children in there who came in because they were in a class, How to Break the Law for Good. And when they came in, my eyes were opened because that too, that building represents how those people had to break the law for good to keep the slaves safe, to keep the slaves warm, to keep the slaves moving, fed, organizing routes, organizing trips for them to take. And so it's just really such, the building, when you look at it, you understand why that history needs to be restored. And you understand why it needs to be preserved and why it needs to be kept and why your children and your children. I've had people children that come in that are white and ask me, why do I need to learn this history? Well, probably the same reason you need to learn Spanish and biology and history, because it makes you a well-rounded person, because you're able to go out into the world, you're able to contribute in a way. When the young black children come into the building and they hear their history, they leave way lighter, and I don't mean color-wise, they leave way lighter. Their little spirits are lifted, that they finally have their history, that they finally know that they matter, that there were people before them that did great and mighty things. And so it becomes really important for your grandchildren, for your children, for everybody. And I often tell everybody, find your history and our history. What is it that you defeated? What is it that you overcame? What is it that you had to speak up against? What are the evils that you've had to fight and try to achieve justice for? Because that is what the Abyssinian Meeting House represents at its core. It is a beacon of hope, and just, I can't speak enough about it. The members there worked very hard, and you can be proud that they, in fact, were truly, truly stakeholders in that Underground Railroad that we talk about in history books and we hear so much about. They were behind the scenes creating all that they could in the city of Portland, Maine to make happen for those slaves to see freedom again. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Pam. And Pam will stay around for a little bit if you have individual questions and want to come up. But thank you so much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you Tuesday at our stakeholder meeting and/or in August for our next program. And thanks so much for coming.
Please feel free to ask me any questions. I always get criticized after this. I expected to hear more about the Underground Railroad. You can't talk about one without the other, though.
Thank you.
Thank you.